what I want to do is explain a little bit, or tell you a little bit about, I suppose, the history of zoos and their place in relationship to wildlife and so on and so forth. And then at the end, I will very happily answer any questions that people have. That doesn't matter what it's about. Doesn't matter what it's about. If I don't like the question, I won't answer it. But if otherwise, I don't mind what the subject is. I'll very happily do that. And I believe there are various accoutrements here which people will be passing amongst you and saying, do you want a hat? And you don't have to take it, but do you want a pen then? Okay, and stuff like that. And I think there's got a few books as well, but that's all in the future. The other day, I was at an event in London where Sir David Attenborough was giving the main speech, and as always he was incredibly sort of lucid, incredibly interesting, enthusiastic beyond belief, but also what I love about David, he has this real sense of history and how things have changed. And in fact, of course, he is part of that history, very much so. Because if I go back to, let's call them the early days of conservation, and to a certain extent the early days of zoos, I'll be talking sort of the 1940s, 1950s, or something like that. And David was saying that in those days, when he and a few other famous people, you may know some of them by reputation, if you're my age you might know some of them because you actually saw them on the telly, people like Sir Peter Scott, for example, and they got together and they sort of moulded the whole idea of conservation of wildlife because they were concerned about what was happening to it, and they also affected the early television programs about wildlife quite considerably. And he actually reminded us, he said, well, I'm not going to do the Attenborough voice, I must resist it, I won't do it. Okay, he said, you know, in the early days, their policy basically was to use zoos as somewhere where they could save some of the creatures that were in trouble and actually keep them in, for want of a better word, captivity. It's never a nice word, but it wasn't meant in any other way. And for example, one of the programs which I immediately went, and anyone of a certain age here, you will give it away if you say, oh yeah, I remember that too, was Zoo Quest. And this involved going to different countries around the world, to India, to Africa, etc., 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 to capture and bring back animals to go into zoos. That's quite a thought, really, because it simply doesn't happen anymore, not officially anyway. It simply does not happen. People don't go on an expedition to actually catch animals, to bring them back and have them in a collection. And as David said, he said, in fact, it didn't take long before they began to think, is this what we should be doing, really? Because obviously the animals belonged out in the wild, and they depended on whatever state the habitat was in whichever country they happened to be in, and the attitude of the people in that country. And of course, therefore, the conservation movement was born, which definitely did not include taking animals out of the wild that were perfectly fit and bringing them into captivity. It involved going to those countries, raising money, trying to get hold of areas where what they called, the habitat was, if it was in any kind of threat at all, it would be saved, and that became the priority, was to actually try and look after those areas where the animals belonged out in the wild. And this sort of heralded in, I think, a bit of a, what would I say, a backlash almost on zoos. And certainly I freely confess myself that if I were to transport myself back to when I was a teenager or even 20-something, that kind of thing, in the late 50s, 60s, I wasn't that keen on zoos myself either. I very often went along and thought, I just don't want to see these animals, sort of in captivity, caged, especially because quite a lot of those zoos had very small facilities. And I remember seeing, I think it was at London Zoo at that time, polar bears sort of wandering around this tiny little area and clearly not terribly happy because they're sort of pacing up and down, which is always a sign that they're stressed or concerned to a certain extent. I also didn't really care very much for the attitude of a lot of the people who went there, because I think the zoos did go through a stage when it was a kind of a freak show, and that's probably how they started in the first place. Of course, way back, in the Victorian era, there were collections where of not only animals but people as well, where the public was sort of invited to come along, pay a bit of money, and laugh at the exhibits, and that I'm sure we've all seen to a certain extent. You see a family, they go along and they're visiting the gorilla, for example, again in London Zoo, Guy the gorilla, who became pretty famous actually. But people went up there and pointed at him and said, "Oh look, it's a gorilla, isn't he funny?" And then somebody else sort of does the movement, go on, and they were just treating those animals as if they were some sort of unreal cartoon type thing. And that seemed to me to be wrong as well. That's not what they are. Animals are not there as exhibits or playthings or doing a show or anything like that. So all those all too common events like chimps tea parties and parrots running up and down on bicycles and all this sort of thing, absolutely standard if you went to a zoo or zoological gardens or a collection, and worked until relatively recently. Then, fortunately, this organisation, which you'll see the initials dotted around, BIAZA. Have I got that right? No, probably not. British and Irish zoos and aquariums. Now, this is like the sort of quality control group. Thank God they exist. I can't remember, it was about the 70s, I think, wasn't it? Something like that. Looking at somebody who would know. When they actually, about the 70s when they first got together. And it meant that there was a complete overhaul of the standards in British zoos, that enclosures had to be increased if necessary. Some animals, it was advised, were not kept in captivity, and so on and so forth. And obviously it's absolutely essential, and I think the result is that I could genuinely say that in Britain at least, I'd very much doubt that there are any bad zoos, for want of a better phrase, or indeed in bad elements in the zoos, because the standard is immensely high. There's space, there's cleanliness, there's nutrition, etc., etc., etc. And the result is, as David quite rightly pointed out, because he's involved in a lot of this himself, the function of a zoo has changed a great deal. It still is a great day out. It still is a wonderful thing to see live animals close to. It still is something which may turn on youngsters who say, "That's great, I love that animal, I'd want to see that someday." And if every now and again, somebody becomes a zoologist because they went to the zoo and had a good day out, it's happened before and it'll happen again, that also is great. But personally, I actually think the biggest function that a zoo can have these days is, and this is contained in the phrase of this campaign that is going on this week, which is called Love Your Zoo, which of course it really ought to say is love your zoo animals, and love your zoo birds, and love what is ever in your zoo, except the people who don't really seem to love it. Because actually the thing I think that is missing in the world in general at the moment is actually care, compassion, respect for live creatures, and whether that's people or whether it's animals in the zoo or animals in the wild. Because believe me, the last couple of years I've seen some horrible things out there, and I honestly think that it's a worrying motto, worrying fact perhaps, that I think contact with wild creatures, unwild creatures, life, etc., etc. Animals bring out the best in people. I really do. Having met so many wonderful people who work in conservation, work in zoos and so on and so forth, they bring out the best in people, but it also brings out the worst. I'm afraid we have a pretty good example in this country. I can't resist saying it, I'm afraid. I think this government is absolutely rotten as regards its attitude to wildlife in general. I won't go into any details about badgers or anything else like that, or indeed name any of the names except Owen Paterson and David Cameron. Oh, sorry, slipped out. But there's no respect there. Wildlife and a lot of things that Cameron has said actually rather echo this. You know, nature and wildlife is there to be controlled. He's actually said things like that. It's there to be controlled. It's a bit of a nuisance, you know. If we have to get rid of it to build HS2, fine, we'll get rid of it, we'll do it, because we want economic growth. That's what we're after. And I do think this country, we're called a nation of animal lovers. Pull the other one, frankly. No, we're not. There's an awful lot who are not animal lovers. But I go abroad, and in some areas you'll see even worse things. I want to turn you onto a list of horrors you can Google when you get home and have a look at the facts and go, oh my God, I didn't realise that. I just instance one. I was in Malta, in the Mediterranean, about 3 weeks ago. Funny enough, Chris Packham went over there the next week. Neither of us knew we were there till we got home. But we were both reporting, if you like, on the same situation, which is that every spring, when migrant birds in the hundreds and thousands come from Africa, having survived that, flowing north, some of them will drop down onto Mediterranean islands like Malta and Cyprus and so on and so forth, and all they'll find waiting for them, when all they want is a rest and a bit of a feed and carry on, maybe up to Britain, they will just find literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of blokes. It's always blokes, so ladies, you can feel good about this. It's always blokes dressed up in their military gear with a rifle, anything that flies. It's horrifying. Anything that flies, any bird that comes up, bang, 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 and down they go. And some days it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It's been going on for years. It probably may have started as food supplement, but now it ain't. Now it's just target practice. And you look at that situation and you think, how do you get through to people that their only relationship with wild things is they enjoy killing them? There doesn't seem to be any other relationship. That's what they do. That's what they like. And then on another scale, you go to Africa or and India, and you'll see the, which we all have in the newspapers, you know, the elephants with their tusks sawn off, tiger skins being, and so on and so forth. There's a hideous world out there with a lot of people who actually, put it simply, don't seem to care about wildlife and don't seem to feel the reason that they should care about wildlife. It just doesn't seem to matter. Just like a plaything, you know, play with it, chuck it away. And I think, frankly, that one of the best lessons and the best feelings you can get, both today, any other zoo you go to, whatever, and not just zoos, you know, whether it could be a dog show, anything like that, where you actually see people caring for the animals, loving the animals, having compassion for the animals, and being interested in them, and they wouldn't dream of harming them. That is the best lesson and the best feeling that you could ever pick up. And I think, to my mind, that is one of the very important functions these days that zoos have to play. They do fantastic work in conservation, all sorts of other things. I won't go into the details because as you walk around today, you'll see notice boards, you'll hear talks from people that are explaining exactly what they're doing. But it doesn't seem to me to be a bad recommendation that Sir David Attenborough, amongst his many, many functions, is president of an organisation called the World Land Trust. They tend to help people in other countries buy land for wildlife. And David, I know, is a big fan of theirs. It was this event he was giving that talk. Now, as it happens, the World Land Trust are also involved with BIAZA, the zoo organisation, which by default means that Sir David is also in approval of that. And frankly, when he looks at a situation and says, yes, I think this is the right way to go, then I, for one, am prepared to say, right, I'm with you. He's one of the few people left in the world that, by and large, you can say whatever he suggests, it's a good idea, do it, you know. So, I suppose that simply means go out there, have a good time, talk to keepers, talk to anybody, see what the work is that they're doing here on all sorts of fronts, and enjoy it. Love your zoo, love wildlife, love zoo animals, etc., etc. Love living things. It sounds like a flipping... sounds like I ought to go into a spiritual or something at this point, doesn't it? But, you know, that's what it's about. We've got to get some soul in there. There's not enough there. So have a lovely day, and I'm very happy to answer any questions if you have any. And otherwise, I'll see you pottering around. If you want photos, quick natter, anything like that, don't say anything nasty to me. I'm very fragile.
Bill, what I thought we could do just now is I've got the other microphone, and if anybody wants to ask a question, I'll come over with a microphone, okay?
Yeah.
So rather than you getting stormed on the stage.
No, it's just very good. Watch this, I'll commentate. Look, see her wonderful movements. She's rather like a gazelle on the Indian plains, and she's handed it to a gentleman wearing the same coloured top, by the look of it.
Morning, Bill.
Hello.
Anthony Butler from Manchester.
Oh, yes, very
You know when you were with the Goodies?
Yeah.
When did your interest in ornithology start?
Oh gosh, this the question was, if anybody didn't hear it, I think you did.
Sorry, was I not loud enough? Sorry.
Go on, do it loud.
Go on. The question I asked Bill was, when did his interest in ornithology start?
Right. And it's an embarrassing question or an embarrassing answer. When I was a kid, I was born quite close to where you're from. I was born in Rochdale, which is now part of Manchester. I think he's been absorbed, isn't it, almost, you know? And he's famous for many dodgy things, frankly. But I was born in Rochdale. It was a very urban area. But every schoolboy of my era, this was late 1940s, late 1940s, I'm afraid had a wicked egg collecting habit. No kids here today, I know, do that. Thank heavens it's died out completely as a children's hobby. It hasn't died out, funny enough, as a grown-up's hobby. There are still grown men who go out there collecting rare birds' eggs or get other people to do it for them and have big collections, secret society and stuff like that. But no, I was a schoolboy egg collector, but fortunately I rapidly, got more interested in the birds' habits, where they nested and so on and so forth. And in a way, it's an awful thing to say, I suppose, but getting out there as much as I had to, and this is just in Rochdale, just so there's not a lot of greenery, a lot of cobbled streets and flat caps and hovis and things like that, but there wasn't much countryside. But I did spend a huge amount of time, and I moved to the edge of Birmingham as well, and I was out all day, and I learned a great deal about bird calls, bird songs, the habits, where they tended to nest and so on and so forth, And I know a lot of people of my age have said the same thing, and we belong to the guilty club, but in the long run, it was a good thing. So that's how I started, and I never stopped. Got a pair of binoculars when about 10 or 11 as a birthday present from my dad, and that was it really. So I've been at it ever since, as they say. Precedes any of the silly TV shows. Anybody else?